What would you do if your home, your safe place, was being secretly drained night after night by someone you thought you could trust? Imagine paying the price while the thief smiles at you across the street. This isn't just about money, it's about betrayal, power, and how one man's search for truth turned an entire neighborhood upside down. Tobias Green had always considered himself a man of logic. Numbers didn't lie. As a systems analyst, his career revolved around finding hidden errors, tracing invisible flaws, and correcting what others overlooked. He applied the same meticulous care to his home life. His bills were tracked, budgets balanced, and every expense neatly cataloged. So when his electricity bill nearly doubled in a single month, Tobias didn't panic. He investigated. At first, the explanation seemed obvious. Maybe the kids had been gaming more often, or maybe his wife Marlene had used the dryer a few extra times. It was summer after all. Long, sticky nights demanded more air conditioning, didn't they? But Tobias couldn't shake the unease that pressed at the back of his mind. The numbers didn't add up. He checked the usage chart, studied every spike, every valley. Still, the pattern felt unnatural. The power surged during odd hours, late at night, long after his family had gone to bed. Who, Tobias wondered, was using electricity when the whole house was asleep? That was the first night he lay awake, in the dark, listening. The Green household, nestled in a quiet Charlotte suburb, had always felt secure. White picket fences, neatly cut lawns, the faint hum of sprinklers at dawn. It was the kind of neighborhood that made people believe nothing bad could happen there. But as Tobias stared at the glowing red numbers on his smart meter creeping higher each night, unease set in. Marlene dismissed his concerns at first. "Maybe it's just the meter malfunctioning," she said gently, sipping her tea. "Or maybe Duke Energy raised the rates again. You're worrying too much." But Tobias wasn't the type to imagine problems. He saw patterns where others saw chaos. And now the pattern whispered something he couldn't ignore. Someone else was taking what wasn't theirs. Over the next week, Tobias began a quiet experiment. He unplugged unnecessary devices. He logged every hour the lights were on. He timed the dishwasher cycles, monitored when the air conditioning kicked in, and even checked the refrigerator seals to ensure they weren't leaking energy. Yet despite his precision, the bills kept climbing. It was like a leak in a hidden pipe, only instead of water, electricity flowed into a void Tobias couldn't see. One night, stepping into the driveway to take out the trash, he noticed something odd. Faint marks in the dew stretched across the concrete, footprints leading toward his garage. They weren't his. They weren't Marlene's. His children had been asleep for hours. A chill prickled down his spine. He stood there for a long time, the night eerily quiet, except for the distant hum of a street lamp. Somewhere, deep in the dark, a dog barked once, then fell silent. Tobias turned slowly, scanning the stillness of his neighborhood. Behind neatly trimmed hedges and glowing porch lights, everything looked perfect. But perfection, he realized, could hide anything. The next morning, he tried to laugh it off. "Maybe just the mailman," he muttered, though the mail never arrived after midnight. Still, the footprints haunted him. By the third week, Tobias's suspicion had grown into obsession. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone, maybe even someone close, was feeding off his home. He began watching the street at odd hours, peering through blinds like a man with secrets. Marlene noticed the tension in his face, the way his jaw clenched when he checked the mailbox. "You're taking this too seriously," she told him. "It's just electricity." But it wasn't just electricity. Tobias couldn't explain why, but he felt the theft digging deeper than his wallet. It was invasive, personal, almost intimate. Whoever was behind this was crossing into his life, silently mocking his trust. One Saturday evening, while grilling in the backyard, Tobias caught sight of his smart meter again. The numbers rolled faster than they should have, racing as though someone was pulling energy right out of his veins. He dropped the spatula, heart pounding. The idea that someone could be stealing from him, right now, this very moment, ignited a fire inside him. For Tobias, it was no longer about the bill. It was about being made a fool of in his own home. That night, after his family went to bed, he sat at the kitchen table with his laptop glowing softly in the dark. He opened a new file and began typing, "Power usage log, day 1. Every spike, every unexplained surge, every detail would go into his record. If there was a thief out there, Tobias Green would find them." The days grew heavier with paranoia. Tobias began waking at random hours, listening for sounds in the driveway. Once, he swore he heard the faint click of metal against his garage door, but when he rushed outside, the night greeted him with nothing but silence. The more he searched, the more convinced he became. The enemy wasn't far. It wasn't a stranger in the shadows, it was someone he saw every day. Someone who waved at him, who smiled at his children, who pretended to be a good neighbor. And that thought was worse than the rising bill, because if betrayal was this close, then the safe little world Tobias thought he knew was already broken. The Green household from the outside looked as peaceful as ever. Neatly cut grass, a white garage door, and the gentle hum of crickets at night painted the picture of suburban comfort. But inside Tobias's mind, peace had evaporated. The steady rise of his electric bill had transformed his home into a puzzle he couldn't stop trying to solve. He carried his small notebook everywhere now, a black leather journal filled with numbers and notes. Each page was crammed with times, meter readings, and tiny arrows tracking when the power spikes occurred. The patterns were undeniable. Something, or someone, was draining his electricity at odd hours, and no amount of unplugging devices or adjusting routines made it stop. Marlene tried to reassure him, but even she began to notice his growing restlessness. She would find him standing by the smart meter late at night, the glow of its red digits casting shadows across his face. "Tobias," she said softly one evening, "this is starting to consume you. Maybe it's not something you can control. Maybe we should just call the power company." But Tobias shook his head. "No, if I hand it to them, they'll write it off as a glitch. This isn't a glitch, it's deliberate, and I need to know who's doing it." His certainty frightened her. Tobias wasn't a man who jumped to conclusions. If he believed something was wrong, then something was wrong. The nights grew heavier with silence. Tobias would often wake around 2 or 3 in the morning, drawn to the window by a gnawing sense that something was happening outside. The street was always still, the same glowing street lamps and rows of parked cars. Yet he swore he felt movement in the air, as though the shadows carried secrets he couldn't quite see. One night, standing barefoot on the kitchen tiles, he heard it. A faint click. Metal against metal. The sound came from the direction of the garage. His chest tightened. He held his breath and listened harder. A moment later, silence reclaimed the house. He grabbed a flashlight and stepped into the garage, sweeping the beam across the concrete floor. Nothing. No tools misplaced, no doors ajar. But when he stepped outside into the driveway, the dew-covered concrete revealed something else. More faint footprints. They stretched from the edge of the sidewalk toward his garage before vanishing. This time, the prints were fresher. The discovery left Tobias more unsettled than ever. He started checking his garage door before bed, running his hands along the handle, listening for sounds in the stillness. Every creak of the night felt suspicious. Every shadow held weight. But what troubled him most was the timing. The footprints. The surges on the meter, the late-night noises, they all pointed to someone returning, again and again. Whoever it was didn't just steal once and leave. They were coming back, feeding off his home in the dead of night, almost daring him to notice. It felt personal. Days at work became harder. Sitting in front of glowing monitors, Tobias found his thoughts drifting back to the street outside his house. While colleagues discussed software patches and system errors, he kept wondering who was bold enough to steal right under his nose. At home, the tension began to ripple through his family. The kids whispered about Dad acting strange, about how he jumped at little noises. Marlene grew quiet, her patience wearing thin. "You're watching shadows, Tobias," she warned him one evening as he scribbled new readings into his notebook. "You're not sleeping, you're not eating right, this isn't healthy." He looked up at her, exhaustion etched across his face. "It's not shadows, Marlene. Someone is in our lives. Someone is taking from us. And I won't stop until I find out who." The next step was inevitable. If he couldn't catch them with his eyes, he would catch them with a lens. Tobias ordered a motion-activated camera online, small enough to mount discreetly near the garage. When it arrived, he set it up carefully, angling it to cover the driveway and charger outlet. He tested it twice, making sure it triggered with the slightest movement. As he tightened the last screw, he paused, feeling a strange blend of dread and anticipation. Whoever was behind this wouldn't be able to hide much longer. Still, unease gnawed at him. If the culprit was bold enough to return night after night, what else were they capable of? What would happen when they realized they'd been caught? That night, Tobias lay awake, his heart racing with every sound outside. A gust of wind rattled the trees. Somewhere down the street, a car engine roared and faded. He kept checking the small monitor on his phone that linked to the camera, waiting for the notification of movement. Hours dragged by. Midnight passed. Then 2. Then 3. At last, just as Tobias's eyes began to blur with exhaustion, his phone buzzed softly on the nightstand. Motion detected. His pulse spiked. He sat up, grabbing the phone with trembling hands. The video feed loaded slowly, a grainy image of his driveway appearing in the dim glow of the screen. A figure moved across the frame, calm and deliberate. Tobias leaned closer, his breath catching in his throat. The person walked straight to his charger, as if they had every right to be there. The footage was too blurry to make out the details, but the casualness of their movement, the confidence, shook Tobias to his core. This wasn't desperation. This was entitlement. He saved the clip and set the phone down, his mind racing. He still didn't know who it was. Not yet. But the shadows had given way to a face in motion, and Tobias Green, the man of numbers and logic, felt something he rarely allowed himself to feel. Fear. The first time Tobias saw the blurry figure in his driveway, he hardly slept. He lay in bed with the clip playing on a loop, eyes straining to pull details from the shadows. Whoever it was moved with unsettling calm, as though they belonged there, as though his garage and his charger were theirs to use. By morning, Tobias was restless, edgy, and impatient. He ordered 2 more cameras, determined to capture a clearer image. He placed one at a higher angle above the garage and another near the hedges, both programmed to trigger the moment someone entered the driveway. "This is getting out of hand," Marlene said, shaking her head as she watched him drill into the siding. "You're building a fortress, Tobias." "It's not a fortress," he muttered, tightening a screw. "It's proof. If I can get a face, a license plate, anything, then there's no denying it," she sighed. "And then what? March over and accuse a neighbor? What if you're wrong?" He didn't answer. He couldn't. Deep down, Tobias knew he wasn't wrong. 3 nights later, the second camera caught what the first one couldn't. Tobias sat alone in the darkened living room, the faint glow of his phone illuminating his face. At 2:14 a.m., the alert came. He tapped the screen, and the video opened. His stomach dropped. The figure was clearer now, illuminated in the pale wash of the street lamp. It was a woman, moving with ease, her hair pulled back neatly, her posture straight. She didn't sneak, didn't hurry. She walked into his driveway as casually as if she were stepping into her own. And then Tobias saw her face, Priscilla Hensley, the HOA treasurer, his neighbor. She plugged her luxury SUV into his charger, set her hands on her hips as if surveying her own yard, and then returned to her car without the slightest trace of guilt. The camera captured every second. The casual theft, the arrogance, the entitlement. Tobias's heart hammered in his chest. His hands trembled as he replayed the clip again and again, disbelief tightening in his throat. Of all people, it was Priscilla, the woman who sent out endless HOA notices, who fined residents for weeds or slightly faded shutters, who spoke with a voice of authority in every neighborhood meeting. The one person in the community who wielded more power than anyone else. When he showed Marlene the footage the next morning, her reaction was immediate. She pressed her hands to her mouth, eyes widening. "Priscilla? Are you absolutely sure?" Tobias replayed the video. The image was sharp, undeniable. Priscilla's face lit by the faint glow of the charger light, her lips pursed, her eyes scanning, the driveway as though daring anyone to stop her. "It's her," Tobias said, his voice tight with anger. "She's been stealing from us, from me, all this time, and she acts like she owns the whole neighborhood." Marlene's shock slowly shifted into unease. "Tobias, she's the HOA treasurer. Do you understand what this means? If you confront her, she won't just apologize. She'll retaliate. You've seen what she's done to others." He knew she was right. The power Priscilla held wasn't small. It was enormous. She had fined the Harris family for leaving Christmas decorations up too long, forced the Goldsteins to repaint their shutters over a shade difference, and even threatened to sue a retired couple for building a shed. Nobody crossed her. Nobody dared. Until now. That evening, Tobias paced the kitchen, running through scenarios. He could march over and demand an explanation, but he pictured her laughing it off, twisting the situation until he looked paranoid. He could go to the police, but would they care about stolen electricity? Would they take his word against hers, especially when she cloaked herself in authority? Marlene urged caution. Just talk to her calmly. Maybe she'll admit it. Maybe it was a misunderstanding. Misunderstanding? Tobias snapped, slamming his fist against the table. She knows exactly what she's doing. She's been feeding off us for weeks, maybe months, and she thinks she can get away with it because of who she is." His voice cracked, anger and helplessness spilling out at once. Marlene reached across the table, her hand on his. "Then be smart about it. Don't let her drag you into a fight you can't win." But Priscilla didn't make it easy. The very next night, Tobias checked the cameras again. There she was, back in his driveway, plugging in her car with the same casual arrogance, ignoring the possibility that she might be caught. It wasn't just theft, it was mockery. The following morning, Tobias couldn't hold back any longer. As Priscilla walked down her driveway in her pressed blazer, clutching a stack of HOA folders, Tobias intercepted her at the curb. "Morning?" she said smoothly, her eyes narrowing with polite suspicion. "You've been using my charger," Tobias said bluntly. His voice shook, but his eyes didn't waver. "I have footage. Multiple nights. You need to stop." Priscilla raised her brows, almost amused. "Your charger?" "Tobias, in this neighborhood, resources are meant to be shared. We all contribute. We all benefit. Surely you don't mind helping a neighbor?" He clenched his fists. "That's not sharing. That's stealing." Her smile thinned, sharp as glass. "Be careful with your words. As treasurer, I can assure you that I have every right to enforce rules here. If you choose to create conflict, the HOA will have no choice but to re-evaluate your compliance." It was a threat, veiled in politeness but unmistakable. Tobias felt the weight of her words pressing down on him. He knew what she was capable of: bogus fines, violation notices, endless harassment. But as she walked away, heels clicking on the pavement, one thought echoed in his mind. She thinks she's untouchable, and Tobias Green wasn't going to let her win. Tobias had always thought of himself as a reasonable man, someone who could solve problems with patience and logic. But standing in his kitchen that night, replaying Priscilla's dismissive words in his mind, reason felt useless. She had stolen from him, openly, repeatedly, and when confronted, she hadn't apologized. She had threatened him. Her words echoed, like a curse. "Be careful with your words. The HOA will reevaluate your compliance." Tobias knew what that meant. He had seen it happen to others. Residents are fined for trivial things, notices for weeds that weren't there, letters about trash bins being an inch too far from the curb. Priscilla had a talent for weaponizing rules, twisting them into shackles to keep people in line, and now she had turned her sights on him. That night, Marlene found Tobias sitting at the dining table long after midnight, his notebook open but untouched. "You haven't written a single number," she said gently. "I don't need numbers anymore," Tobias muttered. "I have proof. I caught her on camera, and she just dismissed it, like I'm the one in the wrong." Marlene sat across from him, her face etched with worry. "You have to be careful. She has power in this neighborhood. If you push too hard, she'll come after us. Do you really want to put a target on our backs?" Tobias leaned back, rubbing his temples. "So what? I just let her keep stealing? Pretend it isn't happening?" "I'm saying there's a difference between being right and being safe." The words cut him. Tobias had always believed the two should go hand in hand, that if you were right, you should be safe. But Priscilla had flipped that belief upside down. In her world, the truth didn't protect you. It endangered you. Days passed, and Tobias found himself trapped in a spiral of anger and fear. Every time he stepped outside, he half expected to find a letter tucked against his door. His pulse quickened whenever the mail truck stopped in front of his house. He imagined neighbors watching him, whispering about how he had crossed Priscilla. Marlene urged him to keep quiet, to let it go. But each time he saw his charger, he remembered the image of Priscilla standing in his driveway as though she owned it. The violation burned too deeply to ignore. He began avoiding her on purpose, taking different routes when walking the dog, lingering in his car until she left her driveway. Yet despite the distance, her presence weighed heavily on him. The HOA, meetings, the newsletters with her name printed neatly at the bottom, it all felt like a reminder of her grip on the neighborhood. The tension began to seep into his family. At dinner, his children whispered about neighbors gossiping at the bus stop. "Why is everyone saying you're fighting with Mrs. Hensley?" his daughter asked one evening, her wide eyes filled with confusion. Tobias froze, the fork halfway to his mouth. "Who told you that?" "Emily's mom," she replied. "She said Mrs. Hensley is upset because you accused her of stealing." Marlene shot Tobias a warning glance, silently pleading with him to keep calm. But inside, his anger flared. Priscilla wasn't just dismissing him. She was spreading rumors, twisting the story before he had a chance to defend himself. He put his fork down, his appetite gone. "I'll handle it," he said, though he had no idea how. That night, Tobias stood in his backyard staring at neighboring houses. Porch lights flickered, curtains shifted. The air felt heavy with unspoken truths. Realized that everyone probably knew already, or at least they had heard Priscilla's version of the story. She wasn't just stealing electricity, she was stealing his reputation. The thought gnawed at him. For the first time, Tobias felt like a stranger in his own neighborhood. The easy waves from neighbors were gone, replaced by cautious nods or averted eyes. People were choosing sides, and most weren't choosing his. Inside his head, the battle raged. If I stay quiet, she wins. If I fight back, she'll ruin me. What do I do? Logic told him to protect his family, to endure the theft and move on. But something deeper, something rawer, refused to let it go. It wasn't just about money anymore. It was about dignity, about standing up to someone who thought she could do whatever she pleased without consequence. Late into the night, Tobias found himself replaying the footage again, watching Priscilla's calm expression, her casual theft. He paused the video on her face, the faint smirk tugging at her lips. "You think you're untouchable," he whispered to the screen. "But you're not." The next day, as he pulled into his driveway after work, Tobias saw Priscilla across the street, trimming her roses. She glanced up and smiled faintly, as though daring him to confront her again. His hands tightened around the steering wheel. He wanted to march over, to show her the footage again, to demand she admit the truth. But the image of his children at the dinner table, their worried eyes, stopped him. He couldn't drag them into an all-out war. Not yet. Instead, Tobias forced himself to park calmly, to nod curtly before walking inside. On the outside, he appeared composed. On the inside, his resolve was hardening. That night, he made his decision. If Priscilla wanted a silent war, she would have one. Tobias wasn't going to confront her with words anymore. He was going to fight back in his own way. Quietly, carefully, with the same precision he used at work. He opened his laptop, researching surge protection systems, outlet locks, and every tool that could stop unauthorized use. His fingers flew across the keyboard as he mapped out his plan. Priscilla might think her position gave her power, but Tobias still had control of his home, and he was about to make sure she could never touch it again. The package arrived on a Wednesday afternoon, a plain brown box tucked neatly against the porch. Tobias carried it inside with careful hands, as though it contained more than wires and circuits. In a way, it did. Inside was his first weapon in the silent war against Priscilla Hensley. He worked methodically, just as he would with any system upgrade at the office. Every screw tightened with precision. Every connection tested twice. By the time he finished, his electric vehicle charger was no longer the open invitation it had once been. With the new surge protector and security lock, it would only recognize. His car, any other attempt to use it would fail. When he stepped back and looked at the sleek black box, he felt the first flicker of control return to him. Priscilla could steal from him no longer. That night, Tobias waited. He sat in the living room with the soft glow of his phone, eyes darting between the clock and the camera feed. Just after 2 in the morning, the alert buzzed. The footage showed Priscilla striding into his driveway as she had done so many times before. She plugged her SUV into the charger, pressed a button, and then frowned. She tried again. The lock didn't respond. Her expression shifted, the faint smirk replaced with irritation. She tugged at the cord, tapped her phone, and tried once more. Nothing. Finally, with a sharp shake of her head, she yanked the cord free and stormed back to her car. The taillights flared, red and angry, before vanishing into the night. Tobias exhaled, a quiet smile spreading across his face. For the first time in weeks, he felt victorious. The victory didn't last long. 2 days later, a white envelope appeared in his mailbox, stamped with the familiar HOA logo. Tobias tore it open and scanned the letter. Violation notice. Improper. Lawn maintenance. Grass height exceeds HOA standards. His lawn was trimmed to perfection. The next day brought another envelope. Violation notice. Trash receptacles left in public view outside permitted hours. His bins had been tucked neatly behind the fence since pickup. By the end of the week, he had received 4 notices, each one more absurd than the last. Peeling paint on the shutters, despite their fresh coat. Unauthorized plantings in the garden, even though Marlene's roses had been there for years. It was no coincidence. Marlene watched as Tobias dropped the fourth letter onto the table, his hands trembling with fury. "She's retaliating," he said. "She couldn't use the charger, so now she's coming after us with the HOA." Marlene picked up the letter, her lips pressed tight. "You knew this might happen." "I didn't think it would happen this fast," Tobias muttered. "Or this is obvious." The neighborhood began to change. Where once there had been friendly waves and cheerful greetings, now there were sidelong glances and hushed whispers. Tobias noticed curtains twitching when he stepped outside, neighbors lingering a little longer at their mailboxes, watching him. At the park, another father avoided his eyes, pretending to focus on his child. At the grocery store, one of Marlene's friends made an excuse to cut the conversation short. The isolation crept in slowly, suffocating in its subtlety. Still, there were cracks in Priscilla's armor. A few neighbors offered Tobias small gestures of support. Mrs. Carpenter from 3 houses down gave him a sympathetic nod one morning, her eyes flicking toward Priscilla's driveway as though to say, "I know what she's like." But others clung tightly to Priscilla's side, unwilling or too afraid to challenge her authority. The street, once united by quiet suburban routine, was now divided. One evening, Tobias found himself at his son's soccer game when a man approached him quietly from the bleachers. It was Daniel, an neighbor who lived 2 streets over. "I heard about what's happening," Daniel said, keeping his voice low. "You're not the first. When my wife parked her car in the wrong spot for 5 minutes, Priscilla fined us too. $100. We didn't fight it. We couldn't. She controls everything." Tobias studied him, the words sinking deep. "You're not the first. How many others had stayed silent? How many had swallowed their anger to avoid the storm?" That night, Tobias wrote a new note in his journal. "It's not just me. She's been doing this for years." The HOA meeting was scheduled for the following week, and Tobias knew it would be the next battlefield. Already he imagined the confrontation, Priscilla standing tall, armed with her rules and regulations, twisting the truth until he looked like the villain. Marlene tried to prepare him. "Don't let her bait you into anger. Speak calmly. Show the footage if you have to. Make them see the truth." But Tobias wasn't sure calm would be enough. Priscilla had influence, charm, and a reputation for crushing opposition. He had only his evidence and his determination. As the meeting drew closer, the pressure mounted. Tobias felt it in every step, every glance, every whispered conversation. The entire neighborhood was watching, waiting to see who would win, the treasurer with her iron grip, or the man she thought too weak to resist. On the eve of the meeting, Tobias sat alone on the porch, the crickets humming in the still night air. He thought of the first surge in his electric bill, of the footprints glistening in the dew, of Priscilla's face smirking in the glow of his charger. This was no longer about stolen electricity. It was about control, about standing up to someone who believed the neighborhood belonged to her, and Tobias knew he couldn't back down now. The battle had already begun. The night of the HOA meeting arrived heavy with tension. The community hall, usually reserved for birthday parties and bake sales, had been transformed into a courtroom of sorts. Folding chairs filled the room, and nearly every household was represented. The air buzzed with quiet conversations, anxious whispers, and the occasional sharp glance toward Tobias. At the front, Priscilla Hensley stood like a queen presiding over her court. Her clipboard rested on the table before her, flanked by a neat row of files, her arsenal of rules and regulations. She smiled thinly as the room quieted, tapping her pen once against the wood. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice calm, commanding. "We have several matters of importance to discuss tonight. Let's start with recent violations." Her eyes found Tobias almost instantly. "Mr. Tobias Green has been issued multiple notices in the past week," she said, her tone sweetly poisoned. His lawn, his trash receptacles, his home maintenance, all in direct conflict with HOA standards. We will review his case first. A murmur rippled through the room. Tobias felt the weight of every gaze pressing against him. For a moment he wanted to sink into his chair, to let the storm pass over him. But then he remembered Marlene's steady words. "Don't let her bait you. Show the truth." He rose to his feet. "My lawn is cut, my trash is stored, my home is maintained. These notices aren't about violations, they're about retaliation." Gasps scattered across the crowd. Priscilla's smile didn't falter. "Retaliation? That's a serious accusation, Mr. Green. Do you have proof?" Tobias drew a breath. His hands trembled slightly, but his voice carried. "Yes. Proof that you've been using my electricity without permission. Proof that when I stopped you, these so-called violations suddenly appeared." The room erupted in whispers. Heads turned, neighbors leaned toward one another, voices rising like wind before a storm. Priscilla raised a hand, her calm facade hardening into irritation. That's absurd. Community resources are meant to be shared. Perhaps you misunderstood. No. Tobias cut in. His phone glowed as he opened the video file. I didn't misunderstand. He pressed play. The footage filled the projection screen at the front of the room. Grainy night vision showed Priscilla walking into his driveway, plugging her SUV into his charger, her face clear and unmistakable. The whispers became shouts. A neighbor gasped outright. Someone in the back muttered, I knew it. Priscilla's face drained of color. This is taken out of context, she snapped, her composure slipping. It was one time. Tobias interrupted again, his voice, firm now, stronger. It wasn't one time. And when I stopped you, you tried to bury me with false notices. How many others here have been fined or harassed unfairly? The question hung in the air, heavy, daring. At first, silence. Then, a voice. Mrs. Carpenter, the elderly woman from down the street, raised her hand slowly. She fined me for having my grandson's bike on the porch. Her voice shook, but her words carried. $50. Another voice followed. Daniel stepped forward from the back row. She threatened to tow my car when I parked it in front of my own house, said it disrupted the community aesthetic. The dam broke. One by one, neighbors stood, speaking over each other, sharing stories of unfair treatment, intimidation, and fines that never seemed justified. The room swelled with anger, not toward Tobias, but toward Priscilla. Priscilla pounded the table with her palm. Order! This is not how we conduct meetings. You're all forgetting the rules. No, Tobias said firmly, stepping closer to the front. His voice carried above the noise. We're not forgetting the rules. We're remembering what this community was supposed to be. Fair, safe, neighbors supporting neighbors, not one person abusing power. The words seemed to ignite something in the crowd. Applause broke out, hesitant at first, then louder. Marlene caught his eye from across the room, her smile proud, her hands clapping with the others. Priscilla's face flushed red. She slammed her folder shut. This is mutiny, she spat. You're all being manipulated. If you think you can run this neighborhood without order, you'll regret it. But her voice was drowned out by the growing unity in the room. The crowd wasn't afraid anymore. The silence that had once protected her was gone. Neighbor near the front stood and raised his voice. We need a vote. Right here, right now. Remove her as treasurer. Another voice echoed, yes, vote. Priscilla shook her head, her eyes wide with disbelief. You can't. But the tide had turned. Hands began to rise across the room, one after another, a sea of defiance. Tobias watched, heart pounding, as nearly every neighbor lifted their hand against her. The unity was overwhelming. Priscilla's pen slipped from her fingers. Her clipboard fell with a sharp crack against the floor. For the first time, she had no control. When the meeting finally adjourned, Tobias stepped outside into the cool night air. The stars glittered above, sharp and endless. Around him, neighbors shook his hand, clapped him on the shoulder, and thanked him for speaking up. The battle wasn't fully over, but the silence was broken, and Tobias knew. Priscilla's reign had reached its end. The morning after the HOA meeting felt like a new beginning. The neighborhood, once thick with suspicion and silence, carried a different air. Neighbors who had once avoided Tobias now nodded as he walked by, some even offering small smiles. It was subtle, but undeniable. The tide had shifted. Still, the fight wasn't over. The HOA board had called an emergency session to address the vote that shook Priscilla's authority. Officially, she was suspended. Unofficially, everyone knew her grip on the neighborhood had slipped beyond repair. Tobias walked into the community hall with Marlene at his side. She squeezed his hand. No matter what they decide, she whispered, you've already won. Inside, the atmosphere was tense but focused. Neighbors filled the seats, their faces expectant. At the front, Priscilla sat stiffly, her arms crossed, her eyes sharp with anger. The confidence she once radiated had dimmed, replaced by a brittle defiance. Mr. Ellis, the board chair, rose to speak. We are here to address the misconduct allegations against Treasurer Priscilla Hensley. We have evidence presented by Mr. Tobias Green and written complaints from several residents. Today we decide how to proceed. All eyes shifted to Tobias. He stood, his phone in his hand. I won't repeat the video. You've all seen it. What matters now isn't just the theft, it's what it represents. For weeks I thought I was alone. But I wasn't. Many of you suffered fines, threats, and intimidation. That's not how a community should be. He paused, letting his words settle. We don't live here to be ruled. We live here to belong. And if we stay silent when someone abuses power, then we're all complicit. I don't want revenge. I just want fairness. And I think most of you do too. When Tobias sat down, Marlene gave his hand a reassuring squeeze. Priscilla sprang to her feet, her voice sharp. This is a witch hunt. Everything I did was for order, for the community's good. Every fine was justified, every notice backed by rules you all agreed to. Her eyes scanned the room, searching for agreement. But the silence that met her was heavy. Then Mrs. Carpenter's voice rose, trembling but firm. You fined me for letting my grandson's bike sit on the porch. $50 for a child's bike. Another voice followed. Daniel stood. You threatened to tow my car when I parked in front of my own house. You said it ruined the neighborhood's look. Others joined in, one after another, their voices weaving together into a chorus of grievances. Stories spilt into the air, small injustices, petty fines, humiliations endured in silence. Priscilla's composure cracked. She slammed a folder shut. You're all exaggerating. Without me, this place would fall apart. But no one agreed. The board left briefly to deliberate, leaving the room buzzing with murmurs. Tobias sat still, his heart pounding. He didn't know what the board would decide, but he knew something had already changed. People were no longer afraid. When the board returned, Mr. Ellis spoke clearly. The decision is unanimous. Effective immediately, Priscilla Hensley is removed from her position as treasurer. Additionally, we will establish a review committee to re-examine past fines and ensure greater transparency moving forward. The room erupted, not with chaos, but with relief. Applause broke out, spreading, quickly. Neighbors smiled at Tobias, clapped his shoulder, and thanked him. Priscilla, pale with fury, gathered her files. You'll regret this, she hissed. But her words had lost their power. She stormed out of the hall, her heels striking the floor like a retreat. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood transformed. The review committee overturned dozens of unfair fines, offering refunds and apologies. Children played freely again, without parents worrying about complaints. Neighborsers who had once kept their distance now lingered at mailboxes, chatted on sidewalks, and even invited Tobias and Marlene for dinners. The silence that had once suffocated them all was gone. For Tobias, the change was profound. He had started this battle alone, fueled by frustration and fear. But in speaking up, he had unlocked something larger, the courage of others. And in the process, the neighborhood found its voice again. One evening, Tobias sat on his porch with Marlene as the sky burned orange with sunset. They sipped tea, listening to the laughter of children drifting down the street. You're a lies, Marlene said softly. None of this would have happened if you hadn't stood up. Tobias shook his head. It wasn't just me. It was everyone, finally speaking out. I just lit the match. He thought back to the first spike in his bill, the unease that had gnawed at him, the night he caught Priscilla on camera. What began as a fight over electricity had become a battle for fairness, dignity, and unity. And now, looking at the glow of porch lights up and down the street, Tobias understood something he hadn't before. Silence was not peace. It was surrender. And when people surrendered, abuse thrived. He took Marlene's hand, feeling the quiet strength of her support. If it ever happens again, he said, almost to himself, we won't be silent. Their neighborhood was no longer hers. It was theirs again. If you enjoy these stories, make sure to subscribe to Black Battlers so you never miss the next one. Your subscription gives us the power to bring you even more emotional and inspiring stories. Join the Black Battlers family today.